Hey, are you looking at buying a vintage Datejust? If so, you need to watch this video first. Roll the intro. And we're back. You're chatting with John P. Today, I have a bit of a controversial topic for you, why you shouldn't buy a vintage Rolex Datejust. But let's first get it out of the way, do the wristwatch check. I've got a Cartier Roadster with the black bezel and the rubber strap. I think someday, maybe in about 20 years, this is going to be pretty desirable and pretty collectible. But honestly, I haven't seen one on the wrist of anyone else for probably since when this thing came out. I kind of just like it. It's a nice casual touch for a modern watch. So let's get into it. Why you shouldn't buy a vintage Datejust. Now, I know many of you out there watching this love vintage Datejusts for so many reasons. I mean, they're popular, they're collectible, they're desirable. They have so many different dial combinations. You can change it to basically exactly how you want it. They just had so many configurations through the years, especially in vintage with Datejusts. But even though I like the Datejust, and most people like the Datejust, especially vintage Datejusts, there are just a few reasons why you shouldn't buy one. Now, I'm in the watch industry. I get calls from people all the time in emails saying, hey, I'm thinking about buying my first Rolex, yada, yada, yada. How about this 1601? How about this, this vintage Datejust? And most of the time, the person just should not be buying a vintage Datejust. Now, let me explain it. A lot of the times that I get a call from someone that's looking to buy a vintage Datejust, this is what they're doing. They're going to Chrono24, they're typing in Rolex, they're sorting by price, and they're looking to see what the cheapest Rolex is that's in a modern size, and that's going to be a vintage Datejust. Now, at 36 millimeters, that's kind of where modern sizes start. Even though there are cheaper vintage Rolex and cheaper Rolex for the guy that's looking to get his first Rolex, it's just not really relevant today for the guy that's looking for a modern looking Rolex. And that's the scenario. Usually you have a guy that's new to watches or new to higher end watches, and he wants to buy his first Rolex, and his budget is in that $2,000 to $3,000 price point. And so he goes through and he sees the 36 millimeter Datejust, and he sees, the price point that matches with him, and then he pulls the trigger, because honestly, the Datejust looks today just as it did in vintage times in the earlier examples. They look just so much alike. So when you get a vintage Datejust, for that guy that's looking for a 36 millimeter Rolex, it fits the mold of what he wants. But if you're that guy, I have to be honest with you, you're probably going to be disappointed, and there are a few reasons that I really need to tell you why. The first reason that you might be unhappy with a vintage Datejust, if you're really just looking for the cheapest modern size Rolex on your wrist, is the construction quality. While the construction quality of vintage Datejusts was good for the time, and even compared to a lot of modern watches, the quality is still very good. It's just nowhere near the quality that Rolex produces today. Today, when you buy a Datejust, a brand new Datejust, within the last 10 years, you can feel such a gross difference in quality when you're comparing it to a Datejust from the 80s or the 70s. It's totally different. The metal feels different. The construction, the lines, the curves, the edges, you can just feel the oozing of quality coming out of a modern Datejust. But with a vintage Datejust, you don't quite get the same feelings. For those of you that love vintage watches, myself included, you get different feelings. You get more of a feeling of the appreciation of where the brand came from and the artistry behind it, more so than the raw quality. Because if you've touched enough watches, you'll easily recognize that the vintage Datejust is just so far away from the quality and the craftsmanship of most high-end modern watches. It just you have so much time between the two that the technological advancements in the case construction, it's just so far away. If you're looking for the cheapest Rolex that looks somewhat new on your wrist and you choose a vintage Datejust, well, you're probably going to be disappointed in the quality unless you like vintage watches. Next, and I have to talk about this, with most vintage Datejusts, they don't have a sapphire crystal. They only switched over to sapphire in about 1985, I believe. So if you're looking for that Rolex watch and you expect to have kind of like this shiny crystal that's going to be, indestructible, which isn't really a quality of sapphire anyway, but it is kind of a misconception between new watch collectors, you're just not going to have it. What you are going to have is a plastic crystal it is going to get scraped up, especially if you're a young guy and you're very active, you're bumping it into things, but that's not always a negative quality. A lot of people like to see a watch crystal that's kind of shows a little age. It shows it's been through some things, the original crystal especially even more so. But it becomes more of a vintage watch than just having a cool Rolex on the wrist. Next, and I just have to talk about this, it's the dial. If you go to get your first Rolex, and once again, you expect it to be so crisp and clean, just like the advertising that they have with modern Rolexes and, this precision, you're not going to likely get this from a vintage Datejust. With vintage Datejusts that have just gone through the ringer over the last decades, the dial's probably going to have at least a little bit of patina or maybe even damage. A lot of watches, especially watches that are going to be at that entry-level price point, that is a Datejust, it's going to have some stains on the dial. It's going to have some patina. Sometimes it's favorable, sometimes it's not. The dial may be missing pieces of the dial, in fact. The dial may also have pieces of the dial that have been reapplied. Some of the markers, the indexes, they may have been reapplied. To expect the dial to be, on par with a modern Rolex Datejust is just not realistic, but it does add a lot of charm. So once again, if you do like vintage watches, I'm not going to obviously convince you not to buy a vintage Datejust, but if you're looking for that cheap 36mm Rolex, you have to consider this. And the bracelets. Don't get me started on the bracelets. So many people expect to get a vintage Datejust with a tight bracelet. Now, sure, you can find vintage Datejusts with tight bracelets. They're out there. They exist. You have the Safe Queen or the Barn Find vintage Datejust that you find, and it's never been touched, and the bracelet's never been worn, and it's in perfect pristine condition. You hold the watch on its side, and the bracelet doesn't sag over. But let me tell you, especially with the Jubilee bracelet, these bracelets get saggy very easily over the course of time, especially with vintage Datejusts. So many vintage Datejusts I've touched, and most of them have had a very saggy bracelet. You hold it like this, and the bracelet just goes right over. It doesn't mean the watch is not wearable. It's just, if you're expecting to have a nice, tight, perfect bracelet like you would have on a modern-day Jubilee, you need to consider this. The bracelet, for some people, is a large part of the watch, especially if they're looking for that kind of traditional Rolex look and they don't have many watches. They're new to watches. So you need to consider this. Now, once again, this may add charm for a lot of people. I personally don't mind a saggy bracelet all that much. If you can find a watch with a much tighter of a bracelet, you will have to pay for it. I'm going to be honest. If the bracelet is not saggy, you may jump into modern day pricing on Rolex very quickly in the vintage Rolex category. And lastly, if you're the kind of guy, or girl I suppose, that likes the watch, you still like it, I can't convince you not to buy it, go ahead and buy it. That being said, if you're thinking about some of these things, really consider jumping into modern Rolex. If you're new to Rolex or even new to watches and you want to lay down the money for a Rolex watch that's going to last such a long time, not saying that vintage won't, but you really care about the things I just mentioned, add an additional $1,000, $1,500 maybe, and buy yourself a pre-owned modern Rolex Oyster Perpetual 36. Now, you're going to miss the date, but you're going to have a modern watch. And so if you care about the things like the bracelet stretch, the dial imperfections, some damage, some wear, some tear, if you care about having kind of the pristine, prestigious quality that Rolex markets and advertise to beginning collectors, you really need to be in the modern category to get a lot of those things, unless you find a unicorn barn find, which happens, but you do pay for it. So for those that do like vintage and love vintage, get the vintage Datejust. I've had many of them myself. They have their place, they have their purpose, but it's definitely not a one-hit wonder and a one-size-fits-all for everyone. It's just not. There's a lot of videos on the internet saying that, the vintage Datejust is the best watch ever. It's just so versatile. Everyone loves it, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, there may be some truth to that. It is a very charming watch. It's very popular. It's one of the most iconic watches that was ever created in wristwatch history. But once again, if you're that guy that just wants the cheapest modern size Rolex, consider the 36 Oyster Perpetual. So I hope you found this video a little bit interesting, and I definitely hope that it helps those that are new to watch collecting. I remember when I was new to watch collecting, the vintage Datejust is one of the first watches that I obtained. But much like the things that I mentioned in this video, I was a little bit disappointed. But that being said, I personally love the watch, and for those that truly do like vintage watches, it does have the right place in your collection, and you really need to have one. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really does help me, especially having a newer channel. Leave in the comments below the things you'd like to see or anything about what I've said in today's video. Also, don't forget to check out delraywatch.com, where you can see the modern Oyster Perpetual and also some vintage Datejust. I'd be glad to help. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Ciao.